This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Peter Sir.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show.
How much do we need to know about a writer's life? How does the life impinge on the work? What is the human price of art? On today's show, we talk to biographer Adrian Frazier about John Montague, A Poet's Life, published by Lilliput towards the end of last year.
Herbert Street Revisited for Madeleine. A light is burning late in this Georgian Dublin street. Someone is leading our old lives, and our black cat scampers again through the wet grass of the convent garden upon his masculine errands. The pub shut, a release bull, beaten shoulders up the street, topples into our basement, roaring, "John!" A pony and donkey crop flank by flank under the trees opposite, short neck up, long neck down. As Nurse Mullen knelt by her bedside to pray for her lost Mayo Hills, the bruised bodies of Easter volunteers. Animals, neighbours, treading the pattern of one time and place into history, like our early marriage, while tall windows look down upon us from walls flushed light pink or salmon, watching an enduring succession. 2. As I leave, you whisper, "Don't betray our truth." And like a ghost dancer, invoking a lost tribal strength, I halt in tree-fed darkness to summon back our past, and celebrate a love that eased so kindly the dying bone, enabling the spirit to sing of old happiness when alone. 3. So put the leaves back on the tree. Put the tree back on the ground. Let Brendan trundle his corpse down the street singing like Molly Malone. Let the black cat, tiny emissary of our happiness, streak again through the darkness to fall soft-clawed into a landlord's dustbin. Let Nurse Mullen take the last train to Westport and die upright in her chair, facing a window warm with the blue slopes of Neffin. And let the pony and donkey come. Look, someone has left the gate open, like hobby horses linked in the slow motion of a dream, parading side by side down the length of Herbert Street, rising and falling, lifting their hooves through the moonlight.
And that was John Montague reading Herbert Street Revisited from the Dublin 15 recording made by the Irish Writers' Centre back in 1997. And joining us at this morning's breakfast table is Adrian Frazier, author of John Montague, A Poet's Life, published by Lilliput Press at the end of last year. Adrian is a graduate of Trinity College Dublin, Professor Emeritus, National University of Ireland, Galway, and is the author of Behind the Scenes, Yeats, Horniman and the Abbey Theatre, George Moore, 1852-1933, Hollywood Irish, John Ford, Abbey Actors in the Irish Revival in Hollywood, and most recently John Mahon, the Bull of Sheriff Street, and he's a member of the Royal Irish Academy. So you're very welcome to Books for Breakfast, Adrian.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Let me just take the title of that book, of this book, John Montague, A Poet's Life. And I was thinking, just before we think about John Montague, let's just think about the second part of that title, A Poet's Life. Are poets' lives very different from other lives, was the first question I was going to ask, and kind of related to that. Do we need to know about poets' lives? And what do we as readers gain from knowing about the life of a poet?
I'm sure every poet's life is not the same. I mean, there's not one pattern to a poet's life. That's why it's a poet's life, not a poet's life. But it seemed to me that in John's case, really, he's an autobiographical poet, and he thinks of his poetry as an expression of his emerging identity. And his identity is discovered partly by writing poetry, created by writing poetry. And he spent his whole life investigating what his own life had been in the world in which he grew up and that shaped him. And there are things that, well, he'd leave things out that would help you identify the life circumstance that led to the poem. And sometimes knowing that gives you deeper sense of what was going on. Like there's a poem called That Room. It's a very, very powerful poem written to his first wife. You can tell it's written to a beloved from reading the poem. But a couple go into a room and they thrash things out amongst themselves. We're not told what. And when they come out of the room, they try and face life together, but everything has changed. And what you don't know from the poem is that the occasion of the poem is their discovery, John's discovery, that his first wife, Madeleine, when she had appendicitis in France during the war, had been badly scarred internally, and her ovaries were damaged, and she would never be able to have a child. And they had just moved to their first home. They had gotten married. They had already picked names for their children. And they were learning that that future that they had both imagined and that had structured their future was not possible. And they were now looking at a different world ahead of them. And when you do know that, the poem hits harder, I think. Like, he didn't want to expose the privacy of Madeleine's condition to every reader and have people asking nosy questions or feeling sorry for her or offering their condolences. But now it's okay, I think, for people to know that. Enough time has passed. And when you do know it, it's an honor to the poem, really. It's an honor to poetry itself and the deep interpersonal work that goes on when somebody writes a poem like that, and that is trying to help other couples find courage with one another by going into a room and facing their trouble and coming out of the room. I mean, it's meant to help other people, really, but it's also a tribute, highly intimate, personal message to Madeleine, and a promise, really. So I think there are cases, and in John's life in poetry, more than in many another, where knowing what kind of life situation the poem came out of really deepens your respect for him and for the art of poetry as a whole, for its importance in illuminating our human life.
And I suppose my next question is, why John Montague? I mean, what drew you to him? And how do you think his reputation stands now? And what do you think of his main achievements as a poet?
Yeah, what drew me to John Montague, I mean, it's just a personal story. I mean, it doesn't, like, I grew up on a farm outside St. Louis, Missouri, and the city spread out, encompassed the area around the farm. Taxes went up as if it was, land to be developed, and people were building houses out there, and farming became impossible to continue to live there and to be. I would have thought maybe I'll be a farmer when I grow up, and my family had been there for a couple hundred years, and they came there when the Louisiana Purchase was made, 1802 or 1801. But John's vision in his poetry, I'm talking about maybe 1970, about that time when I came upon his work, is there were a lot of poems appearing about this place he grew up that have been bypassed by history, but yet it was where all of his ancestors were. It structured his understanding of human life upon the earth. And he had a way of revisiting it as a college-educated person, but not trying to be nostalgic about it, but to record what was lost, really. I found it deeply helpful, to be honest, in understanding my own life. And I was also interested in what he was trying to do in terms of making use of modern American poetry in dealing with, well, it was kind of a Robert Frostian situation, was all attractive to me. And when I first met John, he came up to me in the Bailey, and I was reading a book of his in 1972. And it was an American edition. He said, "Where did you get that?" I wrote that book, And we immediately fell into conversation about poetry, and our conversations continued to the end of his life, and we were always talking about poetry. And he loved to talk about poetry, about other poets, about what poets you liked, about history of poetry. He was really wonderfully well-informed partner in conversation about those things.
Did that make it easier to be a biographer, Adrian? Knowing him in that way, did that make it easier to take on the job of doing the biography?
It made it easier and it made it harder. It was harder because I felt the weight of having to do justice by him, but also to tell the truth, to where he was all too human. I couldn't leave it out, and I knew he didn't want me to. I mean, that wasn't how he thought about writing. He thought about writing as a form of harsh truth, really sympathetic but harsh. You can't really do justice to another person, and if it's somebody you feel the gap between what you're able to do and the full truth of it, and you feel the harm that's also comes from innocent parties that are part of his story, but the book isn't about them. And it's very transgressive to write a biography in which living people appear as minor characters, and that's kind of hateful to appear in somebody else's story.
I found the early life very moving, and I thought it was really crucial to see how he developed as a human being and as a poet. And I was wondering, Adrian, would you talk a little bit about that, particularly the loneliness of it and the separation from his mother and his two brothers? I found that very heartbreaking to read. And it does actually, I think, when you read it, it explains about his later life, doesn't it? And his hunger for affection. All the bits about the stammering and his sense of being unloved and, the incident in the classroom with Mrs. McMahon, all that early part. It was heartbreaking to read about, but it was really crucial for him in his development as a poet, wasn't it?
Yeah. And things like that, life-shaping things happen to all of us when we're little. But in his case, there's a kind of spectacular silhouette on certain moments, of just like me coming to the dock. He's sent back with his three brothers, and he gets measles on the ship. They without any parent, nobody looking after them, just three little boys on the ship.
I mean, he was only 4, wasn't he, Adrian?
4 years old. And he doesn't really know where he's going. And they land on the dock, and there's 2 cars there. One to that's going to bring a child back to the grandmother's in Fintona, and one that will bring supposedly 2 boys back to the farmhouse or post office in Garvaghey. And John, at that point, the middle brother, Turlock, says, "No, I'm going with my older brother. I don't want to go with little John." And John is left alone with these 2 aunts. His brothers just drive off. He doesn't see them again for a long time. And the aunts take him away. He's lost his parents. He's lost his brothers. The older one, Bridget, is somewhat elderly. The younger one is in her 30s and still has hopes of maybe getting married, but small hopes. And then he's alone in that house, takes up his place in his grandfather's big double bed. His accent is a Brooklyn accent. He doesn't have any children around. They don't want him to play with the children across the street because some of them they think are too rough, and some of them are Protestant, and they think he's a cut above them. That Montague's had a very high sense of themselves as an important family in that parish.
And then when he moves off to Armagh as well, he says to the boarding school there, he said it was the least conscious time of my life. So it continued on, didn't it?
No, he's only 12 when he gets sent away. So he's really just age 4 to 12 in Garvaghey. And then he gets sent off with all these other boys, and they're all been picked out to be priests at age 12. Like really 80% of the people at St. Petr's in Armagh were destined for priesthood. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's kind of a stammer saved him from that in a way, didn't it? I mean,
they decided he was, would not be able to say mass. That's a performance he had.
But just to dwell on that, because it's one of the things a lot, because if you've seen Montague read, as we have a number of times, and I saw him once or twice unable to read because of the stammer, and it was such a huge thing because and here he is, he's traveling all over the world and he's reading his poetry, and sometimes he can't, and he never kind of gets away from it, and sometimes it's like there's the one incident in that classroom back with Mrs. McMahon, almost that it seems to begin at that particular point in his psychology. I mean,
and is it connected with the mother as well? The mother was supposed to have arrived at that time as well. So it was like a double thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, and he was never sure what was the cause of this, but the primary scene of origin that he comes back to is that the junior teacher has identified him as, look, this kid's only 5, but he's already reading. He's the bright boy in the class. He goes age 6 or 7. He's with a senior big baby. Woman says, okay, stand up and read that book there. And he looks at it, and it's a poem. He says about a guy wearing animal skins, and there's a naked woman dancing, and there's a moon, and he's startled by the image. And she says, now read. And he stops, and then she says, get on with it. And then he can't. You can't say anything. And there is a break at that point for him that he loses the capacity to speak. Whether that's a fabled memory or a real memory, it's unclear, because his mother, about the same time, came and visited him, and possibly with the idea of collecting him, and was asked, do you want to go with her? But he didn't know who she was. And she had just, come back from New York. And he said, no, he wanted to stay where he was. He'd gotten attached to the little farmhouse, but he really, he didn't know what was happening. But he experienced that as his mother not wanting him.
I mean, who wouldn't be influenced by that? I mean, it kind of fed this kind of probably this great hunger that he would have had all his life, and that kind of feeling of never being kind of satisfied with anything, or never feeling fully sort of appreciated.
I was very interested with the early life there. Obviously, I found that very interesting as well. But his generation, when he became a poet, included Piers Hutchinson, John Jordan, Anthony Crone, and Dennis Dunhue. And we're moving on now, and we're going to UCD, and they were all rivals together. And after UCD, he tried for a scholarship in Oxford, but he lost out to John Jordan. But he did get a Fulbright to the US. And I wonder what might have happened had he gone to Oxford. And how do you think America worked out for him?
These forks in the road are in all of our lives are bizarre, aren't they? What if you had married somebody else? Or what if you had gone to, taken a scholarship and studied in Italy? And, who knows what,
Yeah. Who knows? I often think about that one, Adrian. What if I married somebody else?
So does Peter. No.
Anyway, we're back to Montague.
If he had gone to England, I think his life would have been utterly different. But you can't predict what it would have been. Like, he could have experienced anti-Irish sentiment there. He could have adapted and become very Anglo. He could have become, like, he's a natural born scholar. He might have wound up as a professor somewhere, and had poetry taken out of him. Or he might have been, become a very English kind of poet. He might have, it's wildly unpredictable, but he did instead. He was disappointed, and he thought humiliated, but then Roger McHugh said, well, why don't you, do a Fulbright? I bet he was handed a very happy prize for second place, and he wound up at Yale,
where he wasn't very happy.
Yeah,
terrified.
Yeah, he didn't speak for a year.
He didn't speak all through UCD in class. He said he never said a word, like, until he was 27, and he had been a year with Madeline and gotten some love from a woman in his life. He couldn't speak in front of other people. He was completely disabled. He could speak, confidentially outside of public settings, but otherwise, no.
And yet I'm getting excited about America now because I'm thinking of Yale. Like, he did meet amazing people, like Carol Bloom was there. In Iowa, there was, he met Robert Bly, W.D. Snodgrass, Philip Levine, Donald Justice. It was like a who's who of American poetry. You think that this might have opened up. And also, Lowell at that time was important to him as well, wasn't he? Via Snodgrass's Heart's Needle, it kind of prompted life studies. And in fact, he said about Lowell can be equaled. That's what he said. So all this, like, there was so much life of poetry there. hugely important for him, though, even though he was finding it difficult. He was wearing the wrong suit. He didn't speak, all that, feeling uncomfortable.
But Iowa was a very important place for him.
And
Really.
of lasting importance, really. Like nobody in Ireland, you didn't gather all the young poets in a room, sit them around a table, and okay, today, Peter, we're going to look at your stuff. And everybody's going to read it, and everybody's going to make a comment about it, about, what they think's okay in it and what they think is not yet there. And we're going to go, and we're going to have to be exact about what lines are the problematic, etc. Like looking at poetry that hard, in that closely, had never been done in Ireland up to that point. And it gave him a way of being serious about writing that he did bring back to Ireland. Like he did behave that way with other people. And people keep talking about the importance of Hobsbawm at Queen's, bringing the habits of the group. But Montague was doing that way before that in Dublin, and with other young people, basically.
It's true, and on that, and he was so plugged into everything that was happening, plugged into kind of contemporary American poetry and poetry from elsewhere. And of course, you touched on it there as well. I mean, the other big thing that happens to him in the US is that he meets Madeleine de Brouwer, who you describe her as a person of intelligence, grace, and sparkling humour. You describe her as, and obviously this is an important relationship with him. She was a French aristocrat, wasn't she? And it was kind of the beginning of a deep relationship with France too. Isn't that right?
Yeah. Yeah, he'd been a kind of star student of French both in school and then at UCD, gone to France to pick grapes and make money over the summers, and he'd been to Paris a few times. So, I mean, he did know some French, but being brought by Madeleine back home, like her family home, Belozan, is an enormous place. Like it's really a historic house. And her ancestor is a character in War and Peace. I mean, he's a French general, like he really, for a farm boy, it must have absolutely knocked the top of his head off, and she really, really loved him. I mean, she really loved, she said, just entranced by his mind. She saw that was acquainted with his gifts, basically. It wasn't just, he's a good-looking fella.
Yeah, she transforms him. I mean, that love, I suppose, transforms him as well.
It transforms everybody. To be really loved by another person is like, it's just so affirmative of everything.
We're getting very romantic here, aren't we? We're getting very romantic here on the eve of Valentine's Day. But it seems to me as well that period was really crucial time in his life, 55 to 56. Even if you think of Berkeley as well, he shared the class in Anglo-Saxon, didn't he, with Allen Ginsberg, and he heard Ginsberg read Howl at the famous reading in the Sixth Gallery, San Francisco. Montague himself did not become a beat poet, but one of his most famous poems comes from that time. We were talking about it earlier before we came on air. He's waiting for Madeleine at the train station at Christmas time, 1955, and it's that event captured in All Legendary Obstacles, which did it take years to write, Adrian?
It did, and the event is like he's pacing back and forth and going to the bar, and there was a rainstorm. In like a huge floods in California that even appeared in the Irish newspapers. His mother and brother wrote to him about them. I mean, the event is dateable and occurred. He's waiting in a train station. The train is delayed. There's a big storm. Has to cross the mountain and then the valley. And it was when she got there, had arrived, this doesn't appear in the poem, but just subsequent to that, he decides he's going to propose marriage to her. Like she had been in graduate school in Illinois, they'd met in Iowa. He's lonely and waiting in Berkeley. She arrives. That is really, for them, the beginning of their marriage. So every birthday of Madeleine's, he tackled that poem again. He said, there's a poem there that I have to get. And he worked on it and worked on it and worked on it as to what degree of strictness there was going to be, how ultimately what he wanted was, I must say something very simple about love. I don't want to have this encrusted in irony. I don't want it to be a Robert Lowell-like poem. I want to write a direct and simple love poem for somebody I care about. And what finally set him free is he said he kind of, this is a quite strange, I didn't make much of this in the book, to be honest, but he never felt like he had really embodied the full truth of what that meant to him in his early drafts. And he had an affair when he went back to Berkeley years later, maybe 10 years later. And he was startled back into how much Madeline meant to him, and that he wanted to get back to the stability of their relationship. And he told Madeline, that freed me, actually, to look at this relationship from more of a distance. And at that point, he discovered this stanza where there's an old woman in the carriage, and the window is steamed, and she rubs away the steam and looks through the window at the couple embracing and kissing, still unable to speak. I mean, in other words, it suddenly becomes absolutely a movie, where you get a cutaway shot and there's no transition, they're just juxtaposed, but you suddenly get a different camera angle on the scene from outside as they walk away together, like at the end of a movie where they're married and happily ever after. And the line, still unable to speak, is so profoundly a core part of his being.
Beautiful.
That she is the one that made him able to speak. Like there's like he really loaded that poem up. It's very simple and clear, but it's wonderfully rich. There's no end.
It's very cinematic, isn't it? I have it here. Will I just read the last little bit just for listeners? So, he's been pacing up and down waiting for her and the train. And then he says, at midnight you came, pale above the Negro porter's lamp. I was too blind with rain and doubt to speak, but reached from the platform until our chilled hands met. You had been travelling for days with an old lady who marked a neat circle on the glass with her glove, to watch us move into the wet darkness, kissing, still unable to speak. Yeah, it's beautiful, isn't it? It's so beautiful. Powerful.
Very beautiful. Yeah. Very fluent.
Yeah, very beautiful.
And it's kind of, it's also, it's like, it's raised to the level of myth as well as, it's like it's deeply personal, but it's also like you have, the monstrous ruck of mountains, the imaginary plain. He said in an interview with Dennis Disco, I think once, that Orpheus is in there as well. There's all these different kind of levels. But maybe just moving on. I mean, Dan. He comes back to Dublin. He has these. I suppose the first big achievements is he's living in what gets called Bagatonia, the area around Baggot Street. His books begin to appear from Liam Miller's The Dolman Press, also Thomas Kinslow's publisher. Forms of Exile, Poisoned Lands, and he kind of, I'm just interested in his relationship with Kinsella as well at this period. He's, in one sense, Kinsella is like a kind of elder brother. I think it's only about a year between them, but there's also jealousy at Kinsella's success. There's tension because kind of he resists Kinsella's very sort of gnarled and difficult style. Kinsella felt difficulty was necessary, and Montague wanted what he called an openness of heart. Now, I wonder what kind of relationship did they have as they kind of developed as poets, the two of them?
Yeah, I think when John came back, he kind of thought, well, I've been to Yale, I've been to Iowa, I've been to Berkeley. When I come back, I'm going to take up a big role in my own country. That's what I want to do. And he's persuaded Madeline to come and live in Ireland with him. And so he immediately looks out for a publisher, and he discovers that Kinsella has already got 2 books. And the book that was being prepared upon his return actually won Poetry Book Society prize. And Montague's first sense was, I've been supplanted. He's got a head start on me. He's totally working. He's got the ear of Liam Miller. Liam Miller is like his personal publisher now. And he's actually found a way to write that is getting a lot of attention. It's quite Auden-esque at that point. And he tried to learn from him, analytically looking at his poetry and giving it full credit. He wrote reviews of it in Poetry Magazine in Chicago, and he gave it a high value, but he tried to encompass it, basically, to bring it into his own work and to be able to do some poems of the same kind, almost as if, this would reduce his anxiety. But after a while, Kinsella had him valued his literary intelligence, and they started sharing drafts. And A Country Walk and Downstream, John basically was very heavily edited those poems in draft and spent a lot of time working with Kinsella on them. And Kinsella seemed not to credit that at all and didn't show any interest in what John was doing. And he definitely felt that he respected Kinsella's work, but that he didn't see him as somebody that really gave anything back. He didn't really, he thought he was the one and only, You do kind of have to think you're the one and only to set pen to paper, but he wasn't collaborative.
But there was a lot of, I think at that time, jostling for attention, wasn't there? Kinsella, Montague, Richard Murphy, the whole lot of them. Richard Murphy taking...
among them all, they were just sharp.
Yeah, very unlike. Yeah. Are poets ruthless, do you think? Do they have to be, in a way? Like you say, that literary performance becomes a male sport. There had to be losers. And it made me think of Gore Vidal as well. It's not enough to succeed. Others must fail. So, yeah, but speaking of literary relationships, what was his relationship with Patrick Kavanagh? Peter has mentioned Kinsella there, and you were talking about Kinsella, but Patrick Kavanagh, who you describe as the kingpin of the Second Irish Revival. And I'm also interested in his relationship with younger poets. You spoke about that earlier, Adrian. He was a great teacher of poetry, a great encourager of younger poets. He spent many years in UCC, came into contact with emerging poets like Tom McCarthy, Sean Dunn, Theo Dorgan, Greg Delanty, Nuala Gonal. So he was a very encouraging and generous figure, wasn't he? And another thing I was wondering is, what effect did he have on Cork poetry, do you think?
Quick word about Kavanagh. He learned from Kavanagh. Like, he definitely learned a lot from Kavanagh, and he tried to. But as a guy with a stammer, McDade's was not suitable for him. Like, there were harsh, quick quips there, put downs. It was a very pugilistic kind of conversational setting, and he couldn't flourish there at all. And when I remember him being asked at one point, when you met with Kavanagh, did he ever say anything to you? And he said to me once, "You're a very nervous young man. You're a very nervous young man. You might have something in you of a poet, but you're a very nervous young man." And that basically is because he was always stammering. But Kavanagh didn't like him because he got a fellowship to go to Salzburg and then to go to Rome, and he got some state money. And Kavanagh and Cronin had applied for money at the same time to go to Belgium, and they didn't get it. And Kavanagh was enraged at this, that he didn't get the money that he sought. He and Cronin were just looking for, they were looking for a bunk off to Brussels and get drunk for a few weeks. And he was angry. And when Kavanagh wrote some satirical poetry about, these guys with PhDs, they come back and they get grants and stuff like that. I can't remember the lines exactly, but he's talking about Montague there. He's mad at him.
He also got his revenge. He got his revenge because he reviewed, which I think is a great collection of stories, Death of a Chieftain, but Kavanagh trashed it in Hibernia.
Totally trashed it. Like really, really said it was, should appear in, it was like a ladies' story for a ladies' magazine. Like,
Yeah,
given the
That's right.
general misogyny of the time, that's a put down, basically. And Montague had just put together his collected poems. Like,
totally.
Kavanagh had heard that. John thought Kavanagh knew it, and that's why he did this. Like, it's the opposite of gratitude,
Yeah, I mean, it's like, because that was a huge thing, because he was getting Kavanagh published by McKibben and Key in England. It's like, getting him kind of known in England. So that was a big thing for Kavanagh. And then he repays the favour by trashing. Yeah. It's extraordinary.
Anyway, to go on to Cork, I think looking for Montague's influence on people in Cork is looking for what you don't find, basically. Is John was interested in what he could harvest from young poets. He wanted to hear what new thing they had to say. He wanted to be revived by young poets, and he encouraged them, but had a kind of slightly selfish interest in being revivified by them. Like, he didn't want imitators himself. He'd be happy to show his work to other people, but he wanted people to flourish around him, but he also wanted to benefit by contact with people doing new things, basically. He was happy to take credit for their successes, but he wasn't actually trying to indoctrinate them in writing like himself.
So I was going to say, Adrian, I mean, obviously it's a biography rather than a literary study. And so we're very much aware of the personal life and the many affairs and the lovers and how many students he slept with and so on. And I was wondering, I mean, is any of this kind of stuff problematic for our appreciation of him now? I mean, does it matter? I mean, we see, for instance, lots of this in the Berkeley period. Poets were kind of like rock stars. And we learned that, for instance, he sleeps with 7 students, I think, in one semester. And again, I'm wondering, does this matter? Does it affect his reputation now, for instance?
I think it will affect his reputation with both women and a lot of young people who will regard this as outrageous behavior and deplorable and sense of entitlement behind it. And I think it's damaged his reputation already a lot, really. I mean, generally, writing love poetry is kind of... people don't do it. Men don't do it very much anymore, and women write love poems to one another. But the women writing love poems to a man you don't see very many of them anymore. Like the whole genre is kind of dangerous for people now. I think they don't. It's not as flourishing as it once was.
I was thinking about women as well. Like, he clearly loved women. He was a very personal love poet, a muse poet, very influenced by Graves and the White Goddess. And I'm thinking of The Great Cloak and Tides. And he wrote about the breakup of his marriage, his new love for Evelyn, until that breaks up as well. And at the same time, you raised an interesting question in your discussion of the Dolman Miscellany of Irish Writing, which came out in 1962. There were a dozen men and not one woman. So where were the female writers? Were women just muses and lovers rather than writers to him?
I think, I think he should have included, obviously, Edna O'Brien, Val Mulcairns. There were women writers around that he could have put in there, and that were as good or better than some of the other writers that he included. But I think they were just solely... They just weren't interested in they were each interested in getting noticed in London themselves. They weren't, and they felt they were all unnoticed. They weren't at all interested in issues of gender equality or gender even recognition.
Just moving on to another thing, because I mean, he's a northerner. He's from Tyrone. He was a very northern poet in lots of ways. Obviously, like, we see that in a poem like The Rough Field, a brilliant poem like The Rough Field. And then the career of Seamus Heaney starts to take off. And I'm just wondering, what was Montague's attitude to this rising star and, the growth of these kind of whole generation of new young northern poets. And also, particularly, when Death of a Naturalist comes out from Faber, what does Montague make of that?
He got a note from this woman scholar, British based, with whom he'd been having a relationship in Berkeley. She'd gone back to London before him, and she wrote and said, there's a young Irish poet here who's writing just like you do, and he's getting great recognition. And John started making clippings of everything that Seamus wrote, and he was publishing in more or less the same publications that John was publishing in. And then he would write on them like he was grading a paper. He'd correct words or he'd cross out lines, and then he'd say, this one's kind of like W.R. Rogers, only better. And this is a whole new program for writing that can keep going on. And he was really astute in picking up the emergence of Seamus Heaney. And then he arranged a meeting with him in Belfast. And he said, you should publish with Dolman. Send your poems into Liam Miller. And Liam Miller, perhaps it was a drinking problem, but he didn't reply, or he was just too busy. And Charles Monteith scooped him up for Faber. But subsequently, I think everybody was jealous of the way Seamus won every single prize and got huge sales, huge recognition in England. Like I've heard Derek Mann complain about it, Michael Kinsella complained about it. But John took it particularly personally, in that he thought his own work had been helpful to Seamus, and they came from kind of the same background, and that Seamus really was not acknowledging his indebtedness. What good his acknowledgement was going to do to John, I have no idea. But ultimately he communicated that successfully to Seamus, and Seamus started personally sending him. When he'd write a poem that had a link to John's, he would say, "Look at this, more heavy greenness in this poem from the water, like the water carrier," and he, in other words, became a kind of running joke between them that there was this link. And I think people, it's not a detraction at all from Seamus, is that John learned from everybody around him. He was constantly trying to be aware of what other people were doing. He thought that was part of being a poet, was keeping up with one's contemporaries and replying to them in some ways with your own work.
It was hard though, wasn't it? Because I'm just thinking that you describe vividly that scene where he publishes this is later on, his collected poems, and he's walking up Dawson Street and he looks in the window of Hodges Figures, and they've got all his books arranged in the window, and then he goes to the Shelbourne and somebody says, "Did you hear the news?" And it's Seamus has won, Heaney has won the Nobel Prize, and he walks back down Dawson Street and they're taking his books out of the window and they're putting up Seamus Heaney's books. And then he's being interviewed on, I think, Mike Murphy's show on the radio, and Mike says, "Do you think you've been supplanted by Heaney?" It's very hard. Like, this is his whole life's work there in that collected poems, and he kind of felt as if, through no fault of his own, or it was just an accident of fate, I suppose, but then enormously difficult for a man like that, like Montague.
Well, you guys are authors. I've written books. It's hard to communicate to another person how much you actually do care about it being seen and understood and acknowledged by the world. Is that it may seem like it is a very little thing in the scope of a whole world or something like that, but you have been working on this for a long time, and you put your whole intelligence, your feelings, your relationships are represented here. And when you get a bad review, or when your book is unnoticed or makes no splash at all, it actually kind of hurts, But to have your whole collected poems, one at 12 o'clock, noon, they're in the windows of all the shops, and at 5 o'clock, they're gone, and there's going to be no notice taken of them. That is a big blow. It's
just to get back to that thing, because obviously they're Northerners, but and obviously the whole kind of the troubles are going on fully at all this time. But Heaney and Kinsella and Montague had a very different attitude to the North and what was going on than Heaney. They took very politically different views of what was going on, didn't they?
Yeah, I think, and there's Kinsella and Montague's views can be distinguished from one another as well. But they both, I think the people who were living in the North, still living in the North, were cautious about not speaking too explicitly or too loudly about what they really thought, because the consequences were perilous, both antagonizing the other side, but also being condemned for sympathy with a violent movement for recognition of Catholic rights in the North. And because John was both from there, he cared a lot. His family was there. His brother was representing civil rights marchers in court, but being outside of it, he both saw things clearly, but he also wasn't equally at risk for consequences. So he spoke more explicitly and aggressively than people in the North felt was right. They thought that's alarming and too one-sided. And Kinsella, similarly, he got condemned for Butcher's Dozen. I don't think he should have been condemned for it. It's a poem of outrage, written rapidly and very powerful and effective. But the people in the North thought was a terrible thing for him to have written. But why? I mean, a whole bunch of people got shot by soldiers who weren't carrying weapons, and the outrage does seem an appropriate response.
It's such a powerful poem. I just wanted to...
Because he blasted it out in a week or something.
It is a poem of rage. Just to go back to the biography again now, I think we're kind of coming to an end, but I wanted to ask you've published a sequence of poems as an appendix to the book, and they're highly personal. They were never published in Montague's lifetime. Can you tell us a little bit about those poems?
Yeah, I mean, the Montague's second wife, Evelyn, her father was a GI who came ashore on D-Day and then found love on V-Day with a French woman who was Madeleine's mother. And he suffered terrible post-traumatic stress syndrome and became violent when he heard loud noises. Mm-hmm. Children make loud noises. Her childhood was marred by this, but also it was caught up in whole intimacy and love for her father. So she herself could be volatile and violent in domestic arguments. And John initially, I think, found this kind of intriguing and attractive and fascinating, and he thought he would be helpful and be able to cure her. But anyway, in the middle of the marriage, they wound up with being, occasions of domestic violence that John found horrifying, but he was participating in. And they both realized they couldn't go on like this. But on they went. And they ultimately, John always had to, he thought poetry should come from the places where you hurt. You should write about where really the things that are really deeply getting at you. You have to address them and make them accessible through poetry so that others can benefit by them. It's kind of one of his models of poetry.
What strikes me about them is their honesty and their they are writing about violence and arguments and a house that's loud with angry voices, and there are blows, and the word blow appears in a lot of them, but they're not in any way sensationalist, or they're not cruel, or they're not, they're truthful. Yeah.
I think they're good poems, and they're written right after the Dead Kingdom. That's kind of peak Montague, and because he both couldn't stay in the marriage because of the experience, which is terrible given, he wanted to be a father. He wanted to have children. He wanted to have a happy marriage. It's terrible that for all of them that their marriage came to an end and they couldn't resolve that difficulty. But Evelyn said to me once, it's an after effect of World War II, which a very bright person Evelyn is, and she sees the long chain of consequence there. Because he couldn't address that, since he saw his life as chapters in autobiography, saw his work as chapters in autobiography, is his life didn't make sense without this chapter. Like, why would you... The Great Cloak is about making this marriage. The Dead Kingdom about trying to come to terms with his problem with women and settle into a marriage. The Mount Eagle is about an attempt to find peace as a man within the world with his family. Why did that end? His life story doesn't make sense without that chapter. And because of that, he just stopped writing poetry, stopped writing personal poetry. He wrote translations after that. He wrote some occasional poems. He finished poems that he had in his notebooks, but he didn't continue to write more intimate, deep poems about his personal life. It destroyed him as a poet, really.
Which is a huge loss. But do you think his reputation will last, Adrian? And do you think also biography will last, or is it an endangered species?
I'm kind of the wrong person to, I don't think of writers as neglected. People say, you wrote a book about George Morris and he's neglected. He's not neglected by me, he's not neglected by all the people that read his books. There's a lot of people that read those books. There's a lot of people that read Montague still, I think. It's read him and both find meaning in their own life through him, but also find ways to write poetry that is challenging and brings something out of the depths of themselves to the page, is that he's opened some doors that people can walk through and go farther. I think the example of a poetry that is so lucid and simple and direct and about himself and human relationship, I think that's good for poetry. I think it's accessible. It's important.
It's very fresh. It still is vivid. It's, in fact, one of the great things about this biography. It's brought Peter and me back to the poems again. So we're having a great time going through his collected poems.
Yeah, because you have to go. I think the only place to go after the biography is back to the collected poems. That's where you need to be sent to, I think, after a biographer.
Yeah, it's meant to make reading the collected poems better.
Yeah,
that's the whole point, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. That was Adrian Frazier talking about his newly published biography, John Montague, A Poet's Life, just published by Lilliput. And here to play us out is John Montague himself reading his poem, Walking at Night. And it's again taken from the CD Dublin 15, Poets of the City, recorded in 1997 at the Irish Writers' Centre. So, Adrian, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This poem is called Walking Late. Walking late, we share night sounds so delicate the heart misses a beat to hear them. Shapes in the half-dark where the deer feed or rest. The radar of small ears and horns still alert under the looming boles of the great oaks. To unfold their knees from the wet grass with a single thrust and leap away stiff-legged in short, jagged bursts as we approach. Stars lining our path through the woods, with a low coiling mist over the nocturnal meadows, so that we seem to wade through the filaments of a giant silver web, the brain crevices of a cloud. Bleached and white as a fish's belly, a road curves towards the city, which with the paling dawn will surge towards activity again, and the bubble of the forecourts overruling the stagnant quays, their ghostly Viking prows, and in the echoing archways, tenebrous walls of the liberties, where we briefly share a life to which we must return as we circle uncertainly towards a home, your smaller hand in mine.
I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley, and I have Peter Sarah here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And yeah, so
we'll be back again. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.